In this story, when you hear this, turn the page. Paddington at the station. Mr. and Mrs. Brown first met Paddington on a railway platform. In fact, that was how he came to have such an unusual name for a bear, for Paddington was the name of the station. The Browns were there to meet their daughter, Judy, who was coming home from school for the holidays. The station was crowded with people. Trains were whistling, taxis hooting, porters rushing about. Mr. Brown saw him first, but there was so much noise he had to tell his wife several times before she understood. A bear? On Paddington Station? Don't be silly. There can't be, said Mrs. Brown. But there is, said Mr. Brown, over there, behind those mail bags. It was wearing a funny kind of hat. He caught hold of his wife's arm and pushed her through the crowd. There you are, said Mr. Brown, pointing towards a dark corner. I told you so. Mrs. Brown could just see a small, furry object in the shadows. It seemed to be sitting on some kind of suitcase, and around its neck there was a label with some writing on it. Why, Henry, she exclaimed, I believe you were right after all. It is a bear. She peered at it more closely. It seemed a very unusual kind of bear. It was brown in colour, a rather dirty brown, and it was wearing a duffel coat and a most odd-looking hat with a wide brim. From beneath the brim, 2 large, round eyes stared back at her. The bear stood up and politely raised its hat. Good afternoon, it said in a small, clear voice. Good afternoon, replied Mr. Brown. There was a moment of silence. Can I help you? Asked the bear. Well, no, replied Mr. Brown. As a matter of fact, we were wondering if we could help you. Mrs. Brown bent down. You're a very small bear, she said. The bear puffed out its chest. I'm a very rare sort of bear, he replied importantly. There aren't many of us left where I come from. And where is that? Asked Mrs. Brown. Darkest Peru, whispered the bear. I'm not really supposed to be here at all. I'm a stowaway. A stowaway? Mr. Brown looked anxiously over his shoulder. He almost expected to see a policeman standing behind him. Yes, said the bear. I used to live with my Aunt Lucy in Peru, but she had to go into a home for retired bears. You don't mean to say you've come all the way from South America by yourself? Exclaimed Mrs. Brown. The bear nodded. But whatever did you do for food? Asked Mr. Brown. You must be starving. Bending down, the bear unlocked the suitcase with a small key, which it also had round its neck, and brought out an almost empty jar. I ate marmalade, he said, rather proudly. Bears like marmalade. And I lived in a lifeboat. But what are you going to do now? Asked Mr. Brown. Oh, I shall be all right, I expect. The bear bent down to do up its case again. As he did so, Mrs. Brown noticed the writing on the label. It said, "Please look after this bear. Thank you." "Oh, Henry," she said, "what shall we do? We can't just leave him here. There's no knowing what might happen to him. Can't he come and stay with us for a few days?" She looked down at the bear. "He is rather sweet, and he'd be such company for Jonathan and Judy. They'd never forgive you if they knew you'd left him here." Mr. Brown looked doubtful. He bent down. "Would you like to come and stay with us?" he asked. "That is, if you've nothing else planned." The bear jumped, and his hat nearly fell off with excitement. "Ooh, yes, please. I should like that very much. I've nowhere to go, really." "Well, that's settled then," said Mrs. Brown. "And you can have marmalade for breakfast every morning." "Every morning?" The bear looked as if it could hardly believe its ears. "I only had it on special occasions at home." "Every morning, starting tomorrow," said Mrs. Brown. "And honey on Sundays." "By the way," said Mr. Brown, "you'd better know our names. This is Mrs. Brown, and I'm Mr. Brown." The bear raised its hat politely, twice. "I haven't really got a name," he said. "Not an English one." "Then we'd better give you one," said Mrs. Brown. "It ought to be something special. I know what. We found you on Paddington Station, so we'll call you Paddington." Paddington. The bear repeated it several times to make sure. When the music stops, turn your cassette over.